So this is a short lecture, first part lecture on ancient China. Um, I just want to start off by pointing out one thing. Here's a map. So when we study ancient China, we should remember that in a lot of ways, ancient China is way more advanced than the Western European world. I think that really is illustrated, especially after Roman Empire falls in the fifth century. And don't forget, when I say the Roman Empire fall, I'm talking about the West Roman Empire. So you can see in this map here that the Eastern world was, which is here to the very left of the map. All right, this is Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, which we'll talk about shortly. Um, that these trade routes throughout the Eastern world will exist all the way well into the modern age, frankly. We forget about that because, as I mentioned earlier, when we talked about ancient Persia, we just, frankly, spend most of our time talking about the British, the French, and the Germans. And we don't realize that there's this whole Eastern world here. It's all very interconnected, as you can see in these trade routes, all throughout what we know as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. So I think that's one of the really like harmful ways of understanding history is we spend so much time talking about the Dark Age in comparison to what? It's comparison to this. It's comparison to these this world of Asia, world where and Africa, if you notice there to the bottom left. Um, and so it's there's a lot more connection. Something I'm really going to illustrate ahead of next few weeks, especially when Islam rises in a couple of centuries after. This is around 400 here. So when Islam rises, it's going to assume and take up much of this world of flow, this world where knowledge is spreading and ideas are spreading, and it's going to open up with a cultural renaissance where again the Western Europe is in the so-called Dark Ages. So I think that's this map is really helpful to like just get that idea. All right. So we go back to early China. We're talking about, I think the way I break up the history is going over dynasties. And you can, I think it's helpful to break it down that way. Basically, what I want to do in this lecture is talk about the rise of the Zhou Empire. Um, Earlier on, much like all the other history you've looked at so far, you have kind of a pre-textual time period, a lot of mythology that gets updated and passed on over generations generation. But the first dynasty to really like make a splash is the Chang dynasty. Here is, and it lasts from about 1766 to 1045. Um, and Here the things that come out of here is important. Much of what the Zhou would assume, especially in the social political structure, they basically borrowed it from the Qing dynasty and then re-mythologized it. So you can see the notes there, but just in the way the top structure worked. And this is going to be the big difference um, in ancient China versus other societies is that you'll see a lot of successors and successive dynasties learning from the previous one and developing ideas from it. And but in a much more hands-on kind of approach. The philosophers that are going to pop up are way more involved in the actual like give and take of society. They're not as abstract. In other words, they're not like talk about chairness and stuff like that, like Plato. Um, it had the most developed metallurgy at the time. And there was writing as far back as the Qing Dynasty. There records left on oracle bones. That's the other thing that we know for the Qing Dynasty. All right, so the important part is that there is an overthrow. The Zhou dynasty comes to power, and the leader is the Chang ruler is defeated, led by the Zhou and a coalition of forces. So, so that's how the Zhou comes to power. The Zhou dynasty lasts for almost 800 years, so from 1045 to 256. At the tail end of this regime, you have the so-called period of warring states. So we're going to spend a lot of time in that, not this lecture, but coming up. Spent a lot of time talking about all the philosophers and the ideas that are being featured, especially in this later period of warring states. So, um, you're going to see a focus on trying to address how does one rule over this land region. The other thing is, keep in mind, you have my lecture notes as well. And if you go through them, you can see these maps. I think these maps are extremely helpful because they do show basically the outline of modern day contemporary China, and you can kind of see, where these dynasties fit in. And I have these all throughout the semester. Um, and so it kind of illustrates like, oh wow, look how big it is compared to like where it is now. I think that is helpful. All right. Um, so one of the key things that come out of the Zhou dynasty is this idea of the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven basically states that um, the ruler is the son of heaven. And that means basically that he is an intermediary between heaven and earth. Um, and so heaven here is not like, heaven with like God and angels and that kind of stuff. But think of it more as like the reality. And so if like the king's rule seems corrupt, that will be evident in the way the rule ends up. In other words, if it doesn't seem like people are being blessed, that there's just a chaos and confusion, well, then it doesn't look like heaven is behind the ruler. And so, you can overthrow the ruler then. At least you have the option to do that. And so, yeah, because you're kind of like, your rule, your right to rule depends on keeping this higher power satisfied, I guess. Where did the mandate of heaven come from? Well, basically, the first king, King Wu, is the one who it's kind of mythologized in this mandate of heaven, but it's really the Duke of Zhou is the clearly the architect of this idea. This is someone who could have been king and decided not to. Instead, he basically came up with the blueprint of having the king as a ruler, and then passing it on to his son, King Cheng, as his successor. So it's a really important idea because it does illustrate the centrality of rule in ancient China. And so if you focus it on that way, you can kind of see like, oh, okay, they're trying to illustrate. You have all these different regions that are trying to say like, okay, there's this one ruler, one rule, and kind of simplify the social political situation, but also create this mythos. And it's going to be something that's going to continue onward throughout history. All right. Last but not least is Confucius. And so one of the things I want you all to do is look at the PDF that has the sayings of Confucius and pick one that kind of speaks to you, something that you find interesting. Confucius is kind of like the philosopher from China. In some ways, as we talked about with the last lecture, um, Buddhism makes an inroad eventually, and it becomes extremely popular in the Far East. But Confucianism lasts as far to today. I remember my father was a kind of a spiritual quester. He wanted to learn spirituality, and I remember as a kid he was reading books by Confucius, which I just remember because it just seems so. My dad's from Costa Rica, um, and it just seems so random. He's there reading Descartes and other philosophy, and then all of a sudden there's Confucius. I just remembered from like the book cover, all in Spanish. Um, but if you look at Confucius, he really is more a philosopher, more of a sage of wisdom than like a religion. It doesn't seem like a religion. And again, so sometimes we have to kind of redefine what we mean when we say religion as well. I think that's part of it. A lot of times we talk about religion, that is something that has only been defined and come up with and spoken about within the Western Academy in the last 200 something years. So what's the bottom line? Confucius has an emphasis on learning. Um, he has like most of these teachers, there's these four virtues that he preaches, and so a lot of it is loyalty to the state. So there is this emphasis on learning. So education is very important. Um, there's this sense of morality, public ethical living, right? Be a good moral person. And finally, the idea of like being a good citizen, like that's very important. And like the key Confucian idea is within the family circle, if you can illustrate filial piety, the family lives for each other. You follow the honor of like and respect of like your grandparents and parents, especially between like the father and the son, that relationship. If you could foster that within the family circle, then that'll make for a good, decent human being, and thus a good, decent citizen. So that's kind of the crux of Confucianism. So, all right, I'm going to wrap that up here with Confucius. Make sure to find a saying of Confucius from that PDF.